Hi, this is Mary from Joann, here to show you how to make a mask using denim fabric. First, I'll walk you through how to make a sewn version of this mask, which does require a sewing machine. Then I'll show you how to make a version that has little to no sewing required. Let's get started. To sew a denim mask, you'll need 100% cotton denim, 4 18-inch long ties, floral wire or chenille stems to make an adjustable nose piece if desired, basic sewing supplies, and the pattern template which you can download and print from Joann.com. Or I'll show you how to draft your own pattern if you don't have access to a printer. You have options when it comes to your 18-inch long ties. You can make your own out of woven or knit fabric, which I'll show you how to do next, or you can use ribbon, twill tape, or any flat trim as your ties. To make your own woven ties, first start by cutting strips of fabric that are 1.5 inches wide by at least 18 inches long. Next, fold in the edges of your fabric to meet in the middle and press into place. To speed the process up, I could use one of these bias tape makers, or I could rig my own. To make my own with pins, I'm going to take one pin and stick it through my ironing board cover, just taking a little bit of fabric. And then once that other end's up, I'm going to take my fabric and slide it underneath the end of my pin. Then take that pin and insert it on the other side of my folded fabric. And then I'm going to repeat the same thing with a second pin about 1 inch over. Okay, now that everything's set, I can take my iron, put it into place, and then slide my fabric through, and my pins will fold that fabric just the way that I want it. Super fast and easy. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and fold my fabric one more time into place. And then once that's folded, I'm going to stitch here along the edge of my fabric, then turn once and twice and tack into place to finish the end of my tie. When my tie is finished, it should look something like this. To make ties out of knit fabric, start with fabric that's cut into strips 1.5 inches wide, then give it a pull, and the fabric will roll up into nice ties that can then be cut down into 18-inch pieces. To draw my pattern, I'm going to start with a 5-inch line across the bottom of my page. Then I'm going to put a mark at the 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch, 4 inch, 4.5, and 5-inch points. Next, I'm going to draw a vertical line 6.5 inches up from the 1 inch marking. Then a 5.5 inch line from the 2 inch mark. A 4 5/8 inch line from the 3 inch mark. 4 1/4 up from the 4 inch mark. And finally 4 inches from the 5 inch mark. Next, I'll connect the top of the 4 inch line with the 4.5 inch mark on my baseline. Next, I'll mark 1 inch increments up the first vertical line, which is my 6.5 inch line. From the 1 inch mark, I'll measure to the left 1.5 inches. From the 2 inch mark, 1 3/4 inches. From the 3, 2 inches. From the 4, 1 7/8. From the 5, 1.5. And finally, from the 6 inch mark, 3/4 inch. Now it's time to connect my dots. So I'm going to start on this outer curve and just blend together as best as possible my points. I'll repeat the same thing across this top curve, drawing it down and sloping it to my end point. And that's all there is to it. I'm going to post the measurements for the other sizes here. To make your mask, first start by cutting 4 pieces of fabric using your template so that you have 2 right pieces and 2 left pieces. Next, match your pieces right sides together, and we'll start by sewing this outer curve with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now that our curve is sewn, I'm going to go ahead and press my seam allowance over to the left, and then I'm going to top stitch down the seam allowance to keep it flat. Over at my machine, I'm starting at the bottom center of my seam, and my seam allowance is pressed towards the left side. I like to sew this part on the right side of my fabric with the mask inverted so that it's easier to sew around the curve. Now I'm going to pin the 4 ties onto the sides of my mask, making sure that they are about a 1/2 inch from the top and bottom edge so that they only get caught in the side seam while sewing. Now that the pins are in place, I'll match the 2 halves of my mask right side together and pin. And I'll match my center seam so that the seam allowance nests together. Now that our pins are in place, we're going to sew around the perimeter of our mask using 3/8 inch seam allowance and leaving an opening here to turn our mask right side out. Now that our mask is sewn all the way around, first we need to clip the corners to reduce the bulk from our seam allowance. Make sure you are clipping just through the fabric, not your stitching. Then it's time to decide if we want to add a wire at the nose to make our fit more adjustable. I'm going to show you 2 ways you can do this, but first we need to prep our wire pieces. Start by cutting your wire into 4-inch pieces, then fold the ends in about 1/4 inch so that the ends won't poke out. Next, we'll match the 2 pieces of wire together and put a small piece of duct tape over the ends to hold them together. Back at our mask, for our first method, we're going to work with our mask still wrong side out, and we're going to center our wire along the top of our mask and then zigzag stitch it into place in the seam allowance. When I'm over at my machine, I want to make sure that my stitch length is set wide enough that my needle is not going to hit the wire, but also keeping my stitches within the seam allowance. You'll also see that I'm starting and stopping right before I get to the duct tape ends. Now that our wire is in, we can turn the mask right side out, press it, and top stitch. For our second method, we need to start with our mask turned right side out and pressed flat. Now we are going to match the wire to the center top of our mask and top stitch a pocket here for our wire to slip in. Once our pocket is stitched, it's time to insert the wire through the opening in the bottom of our mask. Now that our wire is in, we'll stitch here to seal the pocket and then top stitch around the entire mask. And now our masks are complete. Let's move on to the hand sew or no sew denim mask. To make this mask, you will need one 14-inch square of 100% cotton fabric, such as denim, a piece of knit fabric cut into a strip 1.5 inches wide by 40 inches long, and a needle and thread or 6 safety pins. For the purpose of this demonstration, I'm going to use a needle and thread, but you can substitute any of my stitches with a safety pin. Okay, let's get started. First, I'm going to turn my fabric and then fold it in half so that the corners meet, And then I want to just give it a little press with my hands so that I'm going to create a little bit of a crease there. Open it up, turn it, fold, and do the same thing with the other two corners. Now I'm going to take my top and bottom point and bring them together towards the center. And I want to overlap them so that I create a square in the middle here that's about 2.5 to 3 inches. I'm going to put my first stitch here in the center of my square, just through those top 2 layers. The stitch doesn't need to be anything fancy, just a couple stitches to keep it secure. Just a reminder, you could also swap these stitches for a safety pin. Now that that stitch is in place, I'm going to take my 2 corners and fold them up to the top center of my mask. And now I'm going to go ahead and put a stitch or a safety pin through both of those corners. Now that those stitches are in place, it's time to make our straps. So I'm going to take my knit fabric, give it a good pull, and the fabric's going to roll up into a nice strap for our mask. So once I have my strap, I'm going to thread it through one side of the mask towards the top, and then loop it around and bring the other piece back down the other side. Now I'm going to put a stitch in each corner to hold my strap into place. Okay, so now my mask is complete, and the center here is what's going to go across the bridge of my nose, and then this bottom point is going to tuck under my chin. So this top strap's going to go around my head, and then when I go ahead and pull my lower strap, it's going to gather up my fabric so that I get a nice close fit around my face. And that's how you make an easy cloth mask.